Imagine a young woman, her heart a fragile bird trapped in a cage of despair, standing in the harsh glare of a market square, her worth reduced to mere coins. Mabel, with her delicate beauty, trembled as her father's rough hands pushed her forward, her feet faltering on the uneven, dust-covered ground. The crowd's cruel laughter pierced the air, women's hushed murmurs weaving a web of judgment, while children peeked out with innocent, wide-eyed curiosity from behind their mother's skirts. A spring breeze swept through, thick with the reek of manure and smoke, yet nothing burned deeper than the shame scorching Mabel's soul. Her father, once a man of honor in the cattle trade, now stood broken by debt and bitterness, his voice a harsh bark as he addressed the onlookers. "Half the price of a steer, good people. She cooks, she sews, she holds her tongue. A bargain for anyone with coin to spare." Mabel's face flushed, not merely from the sun's unrelenting heat, but from the searing memories that haunted her. She could still feel the violent tug as her wedding dress was ripped away, the humiliation of being dragged from her husband's home as if she were a common criminal. 2 agonizing years she had pleaded with the heavens, consumed bitter herbs, and whispered desperate prayers for a child. All for naught. Then, in a heartbeat, her husband cast her aside for a younger, sharper-tongued bride who vowed to bear sons aplenty. Now, discarded and disgraced, Mabel stood with dust clinging to her tattered hem and bruises on her wounded pride. "Anyone?" her father growled, his words a dagger. "She's 22, still got her teeth, just broken within." A heavy, suffocating silence fell. Then the crowd stirred, parting like a reluctant sea. Boots thudded with deliberate weight, slow, resolute. A towering figure emerged, broad-shouldered, his shirt marked by sap and sawdust, his face half hidden beneath a weathered hat, revealing only a firm jaw and hands scarred by relentless toil. Following the tense murmurs of the crowd from moments before, Silas stood before Mabel's father, his presence heavy with unspoken burdens. His gaze, when it lifted, held no malice, only the deep weariness of a man who had seen too much. Without a word, he slipped a hand into the worn folds of his coat, retrieving a small leather pouch. The dull clink of coins echoed as they landed on the scarred wooden table, a quiet but resolute gesture. No haggling, no hesitation, just enough to hush the mocking voices that had stung Mabel's ears. Her father arched a skeptical brow, his voice dripping with disdain. "You certain there's no return policy on her?" Silas's eyes lingered on Mabel for a heartbeat, a look she couldn't decipher, before shifting back to her father. "She won't face judgment any longer," he declared, his tone final. Then, without a backward glance to see if she'd follow, he turned and strode into the fading light. Mabel stood rooted, her hands quivering at her sides. Was this truly salvation, or merely a different cage? Could escape ever feel so hollow? The onlookers, already bored, began to scatter like leaves in the wind. Her father's rough push jolted her. "Get moving. You're his now." Clutching her tattered satchel holding little more than worn shoes and a locket with her mother's faded image, she stumbled after Silas into the swirling dust. Outside the blacksmith's shop, a mule-drawn cart awaited, weathered and uninviting. Silas offered no hand, only patience, as she struggled aboard. Once settled, he passed her a dented canteen. "Long journey," he muttered. The water tasted metallic, heavy with unspoken words. They rolled forward in near silence, the endless prairie unfurling around them, withered grass sagging fences like weary sentinels, and a sky that stretched into eternity. Mabel stole glances at him, noting his rugged face, not yet old, perhaps 30 or less. No ring adorned his hand, only a small scar on his knuckle and a stubborn splinter in his thumb. Finally, her voice broke the stillness, barely a whisper. Why did you take me?" He kept his eyes on the horizon. "4 children," he said, his words flat but heavy. "No mother, and no time to court one properly." Mabel's breath hitched. So, this was her purpose, a role thrust upon her, unasked, in a world of endless horizons and unspoken grief. As the cart jostled over the uneven creek bed, Mabel felt the tremor in her bones, her pulse thundering in her ears like a relentless drum. That night, they reached a humble cabin cradled by a whispering grove of pine and cottonwood. The sagging front porch seemed to bow under the weight of countless untold stories, while a weathered wagon wheel rested against the barn, a silent relic of harder days. Chickens fluttered in a frantic dance as they rolled to a stop, and from behind a tattered curtain, 4 small faces emerged. 3 boys and a girl, their cheeks flushed with the raw blush of youth, their wide eyes brimming with wary curiosity. "This is Ms. Mabel," Silas announced with a gruff tenderness. "She'll be with us now." The youngest, a boy of scarcely 3, wobbled forward on unsteady legs and clung to Silas's knee with desperate trust. With a single, effortless motion, Silas scooped him up, pushing open the door with his free hand. "There's a room upstairs," he told Mabel, his voice steady as the earth. "Warm water's in the bucket." Her legs quivered as she ascended the narrow stairs, each step heavier than the last. The room was modest, the bed small but tidy, a lone window framing the endless stretch of field beyond. Collapsing onto the edge, she let silent tears fall, soft, hidden, like rain on a forgotten meadow. She hadn't chosen this life, yet here, for the first time in weeks, no one questioned her fractures or demanded she mend them. Silas's cabin stood at the pine wood's edge, as if it had sprouted from the soil itself, woven of bark and wild thyme. Its roof bore patches of tired hides, the porch groaned with every footfall, and a mere blanket hung over the doorway, a frail shield against the biting wind. Inside, the air carried the sharp tang of pine resin, the staleness of old bread, and the faint musk of children's worn socks. These 4 were no angels wild as untamed pups. They darted away at a glance, their trust a hard-won prize. Josiah, the eldest boy, eyed Mabel with a piercing skepticism, testing her resolve. Eli, the second, roared with a hunger that was never sated, while Hannah, the only girl, gripped her father's trouser leg like a stubborn burr, and little Benji, the tiniest of them all, couldn't yet form her name on his innocent tongue. How could she ever reach hearts so guarded, so raw, with unspoken need? Following the quiet struggles of the days before, Mabel inched forward, her steps tentative, as if testing the ground beneath her might crumble. She lingered near Silas, drawn to his shadow as though it offered a refuge her own could not provide. With hesitant hands, she tended to the wood stove, boiling water with a patience she barely possessed. The first pot of beans charred to ruin, and tears spilled as the bread refused to rise, a small defeat that cut deep. Her fingers, unaccustomed to the needle after weeks of idleness, fumbled as she mended socks, each stitch a quiet battle. Words felt too heavy to speak. Her voice, still brittle, remained locked within. One afternoon, disaster struck. As she hefted a pot of stew, her grip faltered, and the vessel crashed to the floor in a shattering cacophony. The hens outside squawked in alarm, the children stood rigid, and Mabel gazed at the wreckage, dread seizing her heart. Would a harsh word or a blow follow? Yet Silas merely approached, knelt beside the mess, lifted the pot, and murmured, "It's only stew." No trace of anger, no shadow of blame, just a simple truth that stunned her. That night, under the vast, unyielding sky, she sat on the porch, fighting tears that came anyway, spilling over in silent waves. Later, as she tucked the children into bed, her hands trembled while smoothing the quilt over Benji's frail chest. His cough pierced the quiet. Hannah's whimpers clung to her like a desperate plea. Mabel tried to hum a forgotten lullaby, her voice quivering, fragile as a candle's last flicker. Then, a storm roared in, wind shrieking, trees bowing under its fury, and Hannah's small body burned with fever. Silas, so strong with an axe, stood powerless, his eyes lost. But Mabel sprang into action, boiling willow bark, crushing mint, pressing cool cloths to the child's brow, whispering tender comforts through the endless night. She never paused, never rested. At dawn, the fever broke. Hannah's eyes fluttered open, murmuring of pancakes. Silas lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, silent, but his tight jaw softened, his shoulders eased. His gaze upon Mabel held something akin to reverence, as if she had woven a miracle from mere will and weary hands. With eyes clouded by exhaustion, too weary to muster a smile, Mabel merely dipped her head in acknowledgement. That morning, after dressing the children with tender, tired hands, she descended the creaky stairs and paused at the sight of a kettle on the stove. Wisps of steam danced from its spout, a silent invitation. Beside it, a solitary mug sat waiting, and on the rough-hewn table, a scrap of paper bore a message in jagged, uneven script. "Thank you." No name, no signature, just 2 simple words that clutched at her heart. A faint smile trembled on her lips as her throat constricted with unspoken emotion. Sinking onto the weathered bench, she cradled the mug with both hands, feeling the heat seep into her palms. The tea was robust, bitter with the tang of pine, yet it spread a comforting warmth through her chest. Her gaze drifted to the woods beyond the window, where something intangible stirred, not with haste or clamor, but with quiet, undeniable truth. She had been cast aside like splintered wood, traded as mere chattel, judged by a body that betrayed her deepest hopes. Yet here, in this ramshackle cabin without even a proper door, someone noticed her, not her shortcomings, but the strength in her hands, the care in her actions. That very afternoon, little Benji wobbled toward her, arms outstretched, and uttered a single word, as clear as dawn: Maple. For the first time in weeks, her smile was not forced, but bloomed freely, a reflection of a stirring within her soul. Spring tiptoed into the pine-laden landscape, melting the icy grip that had clenched the earth. Mabel's tears no longer fell in the stillness of night. Her hand steadied. Her voice grew resolute. She began teaching the children their letters, scratching them with charcoal on splintered boards, guiding them to spell their names, and coaxing soft melodies from their lips. She taught Hannah to weave a ribbon through her hair and crafted matching scarves from tattered feed sacks, a small gesture of warmth for each child. They called her Miss May, and she let the name linger, uncorrected. Yet, even as the days softened, a shadow of fear lingered beneath her ribs, an ache that refused to fade. One afternoon, Silas turned to her with a quiet request. Would she ride with him into town for salt and tin nails? His words hung in the air, unfinished, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. As the weight of the previous day's struggles lingered, Mabel found herself thrust into yet another battlefield of whispers and scorn. At the general store, while Silas lingered in line for their modest haul of supplies, Mabel stepped outside, hoping for a breath of respite. But the air was heavy, saturated with the usual murmur of gossip, until a voice biting and venomous sliced through the clamor like a blade. "Well, look who it is, the Baron Spectre herself!" Mabel froze, her heart sinking as she turned. There, by the dry goods stand, stood her mother-in-law, fanning herself with a crumpled newspaper, her lips curled in disdain. Beside her, the new wife, youthful, arrogant, draped in delicate lace gloves, rested a hand on her belly with a calculated flourish. "That's her?" the young woman asked, her voice ringing out for all to hear, a deliberate taunt. "Indeed," the older woman hissed, her sneer deepening. "Lovely to look at, but cursed. Couldn't even bear a single wailing child for us." The girl lifted her chin with pride. "I will. A strong, hardy boy to carry the family name, not like her, as useless as a shattered pot." Mabel's hands clenched into tight fists, her nails biting into her palms. Words choked in her throat, a storm of anguish and humiliation she refused to unleash. She turned to escape, but then a steady hand rested on her shoulder. Silas. He had emerged from the store's shadow, dirt still caked on his boots, his gaze dark and turbulent as a brewing tempest. He faced the two women, unflinching, before turning to Mabel, his voice calm yet resonant. "She's the only one who can lull my daughter to sleep, the only one who taught Benji to stop hurling stones, the only one who turns our house into a home with a true sheltering roof." The women stood speechless, their stares hollow. Silas guided Mabel away, sparing no further breath on their cruelty. On the wagon ride home, Mabel sat in silence, her thoughts a tangled thicket. That night, with the children tucked into dreams, she wove a small wreath from the wild blooms that grew beyond their fence, a quiet act of defiance and healing. As the delicate flowers blossomed near the old well, a quiet ache stirred within her. She couldn't pinpoint the reason, but an urge to create something tender with her own hands consumed her. Weeks drifted by, heavy with unspoken tension. Then the murmurs began to ripple through the town. The new wife, brimming with pride and promise, still bore no child. Her waist remained unchanged, her tone grew biting, and she turned her back on the church's solace. Whispers morphed into vicious rumors. Word spread that she'd entangled herself with a male writer from the post station. In her desperation, she wove a perilous scheme to feign a pregnancy, clutching at any deception to save face. But truth carries a scent, one that lingers and betrays. Her husband uncovered the lie, and the scandal roared through the community like wildfire. In his fury, he cast her out, ripped down the nursery curtains, and spat curses at the betrayal. The weight of it aged him overnight, etching years into his weary frame. Then one fateful morning, as Mabel stood in town purchasing flour, a shadow from her past emerged. Her former husband, weathered and worn, clutched his crumpled hat, shame carved into every furrow of his face. "Mabel," he whispered, voice fractured with regret. "I was blind. I see it now. You were the only woman who ever truly loved me. The only one who—" She raised a hand, cutting him off. "Do you remember the day you let your mother spit on me? The day you discarded me like rancid food because my body couldn't bear what yours couldn't either?" He faltered, eyes flickering with unease. "I was a fool," he stammered. Mabel stepped closer, her voice unwavering as steel. "I have 4 children who embrace me each morning. I have a man who never demands what I cannot offer, only cherishes what I choose to give. My home overflows with warmth, with laughter, with serenity." She paused, her gaze piercing. "And I would sooner sweep ashes for Silas than sit in your parlor as a hollow ornament." He opened his mouth, but words failed him. Without another glance, she turned and walked away. Across the street, Silas watched, a quiet strength in his eyes. Under the fading light of a weary dusk, Silas stood clutching a heavy sack of rice, his weathered face etched not with arrogance, but with something far more profound. It was gratitude woven with a love not compelled by mere sympathy, but deliberately chosen day after day, in quiet, unwavering resolve. The sky above burned with streaks of ash and amber, casting a somber glow over the valley as evening draped its tired shroud. As the world hushed, Mabel slipped out toward the well, her mind clouded with the mundane. She had forgotten to draw water for the dawn, a small oversight in the rhythm of her tireless days. The children slumbered peacefully within, and the night held a rare stillness. At first, she didn't see him. Jed, the trapper from the lower ridge, slouched against the fence post marking their land, his breath heavy with liquor. "Well, ain't it a sight?" he slurred, his voice dripping with mockery. "The dainty little mare Silas snatched from some forgotten stall. Thought you couldn't bear, but word is you've got a brood now." Mabel's spine stiffened, her voice steady despite the hour. "It's late, Jed. Go home." A low guttural laugh escaped him. "Just wanted a peek. Silas guards you like a miser with his gold." She turned to retreat, but his movement was sudden, alarmingly swift. His grimy hand seized her wrist, the grip harsh, unyielding, reeking of sweat and cheap whiskey. "Come now," he rasped. "After all the whispers, the least you owe is a smile." Before her cry could pierce the silence, before she could twist free, a shadow surged from the barn like a storm breaking. Silas. He materialized in a heartbeat. No words, no hesitation. A single fierce strike to Jed's jaw sent the man collapsing to the earth like a sodden rag. Time seemed to freeze. Even the breeze held its breath. Silas towered over the fallen figure, chest rising and falling with raw intensity, blood seeping from his scraped knuckles. Mabel's heart thundered, not from terror, but from awe. Had she ever witnessed such fire in him, a man who rarely even raised his tone? Jed groaned pitifully in the dirt, but Silas stood unyielding, a silent guardian in the dim twilight. How could such quiet strength erupt into something so fierce? Following the tense encounter outside, Silas turned away from the lingering shadow of conflict and fixed his gaze on Mabel, his eyes stormy with a fierce, untamed emotion. "Are you okay?" he murmured, his voice a quiet rumble, heavy with concern. She gave a faint nod, though her glassy stare betrayed her inner turmoil, and her hands quivered like leaves in a storm. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her words barely audible, uncertain of what she even apologized for. Silas stepped nearer, his presence a steady anchor. With a tender gesture, he untied the crimson kerchief from around his neck and reached for her hand, the one Jed had so roughly seized. Carefully, he wound the fabric around her wrist, a silent shield. "No one lays a hand on you," he declared, his tone resolute, unyielding, yet devoid of rage. "Not unless I allow it." Then, glancing at his own battered hand, marked with bruises and streaks of blood, he shook his head with a bitter sigh. "Foolish," he grumbled under his breath, chastising himself more than anyone else. Back within the shelter of the house, Mabel tended to his wounded knuckles. Using warm, boiled water and a pristine strip of muslin, she worked in a silence thick with unspoken feelings, a charged undercurrent swirling between them. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "He would have walked away." Silas met her gaze, his eyes softening like dusk over a restless sea. "He shouldn't have touched you." As she gently wiped away the blood, she murmured, "But you hate fighting." His response came steady and sure. "I hate seeing you hurt even more." Her breath hitched, eyes blinking back a sudden sting. "I cried," she confessed, voice trembling. "Not from fear, but because no one has ever defended me like that." Silas remained silent, his look one of quiet reverence, as if she were something precious, not fragile, but fiercely worth protecting. When she finished, she leaned back, and he tested his fingers with a faint grimace. "Thank you," she whispered, her gratitude a fragile thread. He merely shrugged, his words carrying a quiet conviction. "I don't want to live in a world where men like him think they can speak to you that way." A small, tender smile curved her lips, brimming with unspoken thanks. Her wrist still throbbed with a dull ache, yet her heart, after so many hollow years, felt cradled in warmth. Outside, the night sky glittered with piercing stars, while inside, a man who seldom spoke above a whisper had raised his hand in her defense. How could such a quiet soul harbor such fierce loyalty? She, a woman so often diminished, deemed too small to hold significance, had always been guarded as if she were a rare treasure. It wasn't love in its fullest bloom, but it bore the tender outline of what love could become. The morning was etched in frost, a brittle sheen that gripped the defense posts and turned each breath into a fleeting wisp of mist. In the kitchen, Mabel's hands worked the dough with a quiet rhythm, her fingers dusted with flour, when a piercing scream shattered the stillness of the yard. It was a cry so sharp, so laden with fear, that it could only belong to one of the children. The bowl slipped from her grasp, flour exploding into the air like a sudden snowstorm as she bolted barefoot across the hard-packed earth. There, by the woodpile, lay Silas's youngest, Caleb, his small frame crumpled in agony, his leg twisted unnaturally beneath him, and nearby, the axe gleamed with a cruel edge, streaked with crimson. "Dear heaven," she breathed, collapsing to her knees beside him. Silas was already there, his face a mask of resolve, his arms steady as he cradled the boy with heartbreaking care. "Boil water," he instructed, his tone even yet urgent. "Fetch the bandages from the pantry." Her heart thundered as she raced back, hands fumbling in her frantic haste. When she returned, Silas had laid Caleb on the kitchen table, the boy's torn pants revealing a deep, jagged wound on his thigh. Blood pulsed from the gash, vivid and relentless. Mabel's hands trembled as she pressed a cloth to the injury, her voice breaking as Caleb's cries pierced her soul. "I know, sweet boy," she murmured, tears spilling. "I know, it hurts. Just hold on." Her tears mingled with the blood as she cleaned and bound the wound, each knot a silent prayer. Then, through gritted teeth, a faint voice emerged. "Don't cry, Mama." The word hung in the humid air, heavy with meaning. "Mama," Caleb's eyes, glassy with pain, met hers. "You make the best biscuits. You sing so soft, like my real mama did." Mabel's trembling hand cupped his cheek, her tears flowing unchecked as her heart ached with a bittersweet warmth. As the boy lay resting with his leg propped up, the other children huddled close to the flickering fire, their small faces glowing in its warmth. One child, with tender care, draped a worn blanket over Mabel's shoulders. Another pressed a tiny carved horse into her hand, a silent offering of trust. Then, the middle child, a freckled girl with a furrowed brow full of earnestness, echoed Papa's words. "You're staying." Her voice was small but heavy with hope. "Does that mean you're our mama now?" Mabel's throat tightened, words failing her. She could only nod, and that simple gesture was enough. No grand declarations were needed. From that sacred night onward, they called her Mama not with fanfare, but with a quiet, unshakable truth. It was a title woven from affection, not blood. Silas observed it all, a silent sentinel in the shadows. He saw how Mabel clasped their trembling hands when nightmares crept in, how she wove their hair into neat braids with a gentleness that spoke volumes, how her gaze melted whenever one of them murmured her name. Later, as the house fell into a hush, Silas found her alone on the porch, bathed in starlight. He lingered there, a tall figure wrestling with words, before finally breaking the stillness. "I've never been good with talking, you know that." She glanced up, her eyes searching. "Do you say what matters?" He gave a slow nod. "When I paid that sum at the market, I thought I was setting you free. Never figured I had any claim to hold you here." Mabel's heart pounded as he went on. "I reckoned you'd go once you found your way. And if that's your wish, I won't stand in it. I won't bind you to a bargain born of necessity." Her body quivered, not with fear, but with something ancient and raw. I once believed love was being picked at first glance, she whispered, her voice fragile yet firm. But I've come to see a deeper truth. It's being chosen again, after every flaw is laid bare. Silas's jaw clenched, emotion flickering in his stoic frame. If you're not pushing me out, she added, her breath catching, then I'm not going. As the echoes of their shared past lingered in the crisp air, the old porch groaned softly under her cautious steps. She reached for his rough, weathered hand, her voice trembling with raw emotion. I didn't give life to these children, she confessed, but they've shaped me into someone I never dreamed I could become. And you, oh, how you've let me embrace that role without ever asking for a piece of my soul in return. His gaze met hers, not clouded by longing or remorse, but illuminated by pure wonder, as if she, not he, had been his salvation. All I ever wanted was your safety, he murmured, his voice a quiet anchor. Her response came swift and fierce. And now I yearn for more than just safety. He drew her close, not with the greed of possession, but with the tender reverence of a man granted a rare second chance, wise enough to cherish it with care. Inside, the fire sputtered softly, casting faint shadows, while outside, frost painted delicate patterns on the earth. Yet between them, a warmth blossomed, a silent vow forged not by lineage, but by the deep ache of belonging. At dawn, the first golden rays pierced through the towering pines, bathing the world in a gentle glow. Mabel walked beside Silas's eldest, their hands entwined, tracing the dusty path to the modest one-room schoolhouse. The boy, just 10, gripped her hand with a small but determined strength, his bright eyes flashing with a mischievous smirk that often tugged at her heart. Should she chide him or press a kiss to his brow? Today, though, he was subdued, perhaps anxious, clutching his reader like a lifeline. They arrived at the humble structure, where a lanky teacher, spectacles slipping down his narrow nose, greeted them with a courteous nod. "Just sorting through some paperwork," he explained, rifling through documents. "I need to complete the birth registry, ma'am." Mabel smoothed the boy's collar with a tender touch, nodding. "What's your full name, young man?" the teacher inquired. The boy stood tall, chest puffed with quiet pride. "Thomas Jennings." "And your mother's name?" A heartbeat of silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. As the teacher's pen lingered in the air, Mabel felt her breath snag in her throat, a fragile thread of anticipation. Thomas lifted his gaze to her, then returned it to the teacher, his young voice ringing with unshakable certainty. "Mabel Silas," he declared. Her eyes fluttered in disbelief. Her heart seemed to stumble, caught in a fleeting pause. "Is that your mother's married name?" the teacher inquired, a trace of puzzlement in her tone. Thomas nodded, his expression carrying a gravity far beyond his tender years. "That's what we call her," he affirmed. The teacher, perhaps accustomed to the tangled histories of frontier kin, jotted it down with a gentle smile. "Very well, Mabel Silas it is," she said warmly. Stepping back into the crisp outdoor air, Mabel felt a prickling heat behind her eyes, a silent ache that lingered. She had borne many names through her weary years. Mabel Barnes, tethered to a father who traded her worth for coin. Mabel Jennings, bound as a wife to a man who spurned her barrenness before shattering her spirit. Mabel, nothing. A cruel murmur trailing her through market stalls. Yet this name, Mabel Silas, was different. It wasn't forged by law or forced by a man's will. It was gifted by a child, pure in intent, untainted by deceit or flattery, just raw, unvarnished truth. Oh, what weight a simple name could hold. Back at the cabin, the familiar scent of smoke and pine enveloped them like a tender embrace. Silas sat at the table, his rough hands shaping something delicate, perhaps a bird. He glanced up with a quiet grunt. "The boy do all right?" he asked. "He did far more than all right," Mabel murmured, her voice a soft tremor of pride. That evening, as she folded laundry by the flickering fireplace, Silas approached and placed something beside her, a leather-bound notebook, its pages pristine, untouched by ink or stain. He settled next to her, his calloused hands resting on his knees. "I ain't got much that ain't stained with sap or earth," he admitted, his words slow and earnest. "But I reckon if anyone deserves a clean slate, it's you." She opened the book, her fingers tracing the first blank page, empty, waiting. "I used to dream of beginning anew," she whispered, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Could this be the start she'd longed for? "I never imagined I'd be the one to shape my own tale." Silas gave a quiet nod, his voice steady yet tender. Write whatever your heart desires or leave it blank. This story belongs to you." She gazed at him, her eyes searching his. "Will you read it?" His reply was soft, a vow in itself. "Only if you wish me to." Turning back to the blank page, she gripped the pen as if it held a sacred oath. With slow, purposeful strokes, she etched her truth. "Today marks the first time I've been loved without needing to bring life into this world." She didn't lift her gaze as the words flowed, for she didn't need to. The warmth beside her, the unspoken trust filling the cabin, the gentle way Thomas had spoken her name, it was all undeniable, all real. When her hand stilled, Silas reached over, his touch light, as he eased the pen from her trembling fingers and placed it aside. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture of profound connection. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a quiet caress. "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "For lingering long enough for us to cherish you, isn't that right?" In that serene, firelit room, bathed in the glow of flickering flames, the woman once traded for less than livestock found herself reborn, not through legal bonds or ceremonies, but through something far more enduring, something pure and unshakable. Outside, a merciless heat draped the land like a suffocating shroud. Rain had forsaken the earth for over 7 weeks. The once lush borders of Cross Hollow now lay parched and fractured, as if the very soil had forgotten how to sigh with life. Trees stood in mournful silence. The creek behind their home, once echoing with the chorus of frogs and children's laughter, had dwindled to a pitiful, muddy thread. Crops succumbed to the sun's unrelenting gaze. First the corn, then the beans, wilting in despair. Silas spoke little, but his shoulders bore an ever-growing burden. Each day he toiled longer, ate sparingly, returning with earth tangled in his hair and a quiet defeat shadowing his eyes. Mabel watched the children ration potatoes as if they were precious gems. At night, she heard the hollow rumble of their hunger, a sound that pierced her soul. How could the land, once so generous, turn its back on them now? Following the quiet resilience of those around her, not a soul uttered a grievance, not even the littlest ones who had mastered courage when tears had long run dry. Yet Mabel refused to surrender to the hush that enveloped them. No, not in this moment of dire need. With the first light of dawn barely kissing the horizon, she rose, her spirit unyielding. She hauled every bucket, pot, and basin to the ancient well, drawing water from its shadowy depths with a fierce determination. Binding her hair beneath a worn scarf and wrapping her hands in tattered cloth, she strode with purpose to the barren garden, a graveyard of forgotten dreams. There, she battled the unyielding earth, as tough as granite, clawing it apart, churning it, creating a haven for roots where none dared to hope. Onlookers gazed in silent awe or pity. Some extended hands of aid, but Mabel stood resolute. This was her war to wage, her ground to reclaim. Each sunrise she nurtured her patch with water, and each twilight she inspected the soil with tender care. When the frail leaves drooped, her voice rose in soft, ancient lullabies, coaxing life back as she poured sustenance at their roots. Then came an afternoon heavy with dread. Silas staggered in, his face drained of color, legs faltering. She caught him just before the fall. "Just weary," he croaked, brushing her concern aside, but the fever's fire scorched his skin beneath her touch. For 2 endless nights, fever gripped him, and Mabel never wavered, cooling his brow with damp cloths, easing broth past his trembling lips amid harsh coughs. She wove tales of lush hills and fresh loaves, her voice quivering with unspoken terror. One stormy night, as the wind wailed like a lost spirit against the shutters, Silas stirred, his hand groping in the dark, murmuring, "Mabel, don't leave me. Not you too." Her heart clenched. Bending close, her lips grazed his fevered temple. "I'm here," she breathed. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed. And oh, how I'm needed." By dawn's mercy, the fever relented. When his eyes fluttered open, there she was, hair wild, a smear of earth on her cheek, hands calloused from toil but ever steadfast. Following the tender echoes of the past, the warmth between them remained an unshakable constant. "You look half a ghost," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. She let out a soft chuckle, her eyes glinting with weary humor. "Take a good look in the mirror, Silas." Beyond the window, the garden clung to life, refusing to surrender. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. Tiny emerald spears pierced the soil, stretching toward a reluctant sky, hungry for renewal. Days slipped by and then a cry shattered the quiet. One of the boys burst through the door, breathless. "May, come quick! There's a tomato!" Mabel dashed outside, heart pounding. And there it was, a defiant splash of crimson, gripping the vine as if challenging the merciless sun. Silas trailed behind, his steps heavy with time. He stopped beside her, gazing at that lone fruit with something like disbelief. "How?" he murmured, his voice scraped raw by wonder. She turned to him, her eyes steady. "You showed me that the things worth holding onto never come without a fight." His gaze dropped to her hands, rough and blistered from toil. Then, silently, he knelt, pressing his lips to each scarred knuckle, gentle as a whispered prayer. That evening, they divided the tomato among 6 souls. Sliced into fragments thinner than whispers, it still tasted of triumph, each bite a vow, the sweetest they'd ever known. As the fire dwindled and the children lay sprawled in slumber across the floor, Silas reached for her hand. "I've little left to offer," he confessed, his tone heavy. "The land withers, my strength ebbs. All I've got is this broken patch, these little ones, and you." Her smile was a quiet balm. "And that's a world more than enough. Before you, my name was a burden no one dared speak. Now I have a garden that bears my touch, children who anchor me, and a man who begged me to stay, even when the rains forgot us." Silas kissed her hands once more. Could there be a greater miracle than this? "You've grown beauty without a drop from the heavens." Outside, beneath a sky still withholding its mercy, the garden pulsed faintly, alive, persisting, just as she did. Years drifted on, yet the wind over the hill stayed unchanged, carrying the familiar aroma of parched earth and sun-warmed pine, a memory etched in every gust. And there lingered the delicate, defiant aroma of mustard greens, thriving against every hardship in Mabel's cherished plot. What began as a mere scattering of seeds on parched, fractured earth had blossomed into a sprawling haven behind their modest home. It wasn't polished or pristine. No. It swayed with the whims of the wind, grew in jagged, untamed rows, and tumbled over rough stones, encroaching on the narrow path. Yet it pulsed with life, a living testament to her grit. Each dawn, Silas would stand on the weathered porch, hands clasped behind him, gazing at Mabel as she nurtured her sanctuary. Words never passed his lips during those sacred moments. He simply observed, as if bearing witness to a quiet miracle that needed no fanfare to flourish. Then came a fateful spring, shattering the stillness. Men arrived, government officials with polished boots and spotless hats, clutching maps and hollow assurances. "A railroad will carve through this hill," one declared with cold certainty, "will compensate you handsomely." Mabel stood beside Silas, her fingers trembling beneath the folds of her apron. "Imagine what this could mean for your children," the man pressed. A proper house, not just dirt and whispered tales. But Silas's gaze drifted beyond their crisp papers and rehearsed grins, settling on the garden that held his world. The plants danced lightly in the breeze. He saw the fence he'd crafted with calloused hands, the swing Mabel had tied to the ancient oak, the small stones marking their old dog's resting place, and the worn bench where they'd huddled through that first brutal winter. Every fragment of his heart was rooted here. "No," he stated, resolute and unyielding. They persisted, but he raised a steady hand. "I'm not leaving. This land isn't for sale." That night, under a somber sky, Silas and Mabel drove a wooden sign into the earth by the roadside. It bore a simple truth: not for sale. Once someone had been granted refuge here, and that, to them, was everything. Word rippled through the town. Some scoffed, while others pondered. Could such defiance withstand the march of progress? As time wove its silent tapestry, they nodded in quiet accord, grasping truths deeper than words could convey. Years unfurled like petals, and their children wove new threads into the family's fabric, bringing home spouses and the joyous chaos of grandchildren. The house thrummed with life echoes of laughter, the warm scent of fresh bread, and the staccato patter of tiny feet racing through the halls. Life embedded itself into the hill, unseen by distant eyes, yet as enduring as ancient roots, firm and unyielding. And the garden, oh, that garden, it refused to surrender. Even through parched summers, it surged back to life. No longer just mustard greens, but a vibrant mosaic of beans, corn, onions, and sunflowers towering high, offering secret hideaways for little explorers. On a golden autumn afternoon, as leaves crunched underfoot, a curious grandson tugged at Silas's sleeve. "Grandpa, why isn't it just Mabel's garden? Why not name it so?" With a gentle hand, Silas led the boy to the weathered gate, pointing to the archway above. Etched into the wood with painstaking care were the words, "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." The boy's eyes widened. "So, she gave you a new beginning." Silas's smile was a quiet sunrise. "She gave me the world, my boy. Everything." When Mabel slipped into eternal rest, they laid her beneath the garden's edge, under the tree where her wind chimes once sang with the breeze. On her stone, Silas carved a single trembling line. Here grew all she was denied, and all she bestowed regardless. Each dawn he sat by her side until one morning. He stayed behind. They placed him beside her, under that same whispering tree. The garden, undeterred, flourished endlessly. Long after the railroad bent around the hill, long after the men in suits forgot their purpose, wanderers passing the ancient fence would pause to read the sign, "Not for sale." Can a place truly hold the memory of those who clung to it with fierce devotion? Do barren hills blossom for those who dared to love when all seemed lost? Here we stand in the very heart of untamed passion at Wild West Love Stories. We offer more than fleeting romance. We unveil raw courage, profound sacrifice, and a love that emerges from barren earth, enduring through the harshest of storms. Tales like Mabel and Silas's whisper to us that even the most overlooked valleys cradle the strongest bonds. Can you feel the pull of such unbreakable devotion? If your soul yearns for more sagas of loyalty, rebellion, and hard-won dreams, don't hesitate. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell to never miss a journey into the wild beating core of the